Hello everyone, and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we'll endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show, and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we'll be talking about the murders of Harry and Harriette Moore. Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriette V. Moore were pioneer activists and leaders of the early civil rights movement in the United States and became the first martyrs of the movement. On the night of Christmas, December 25th of 1951, a bomb that had been placed under the bedroom floors of the Moores' home in Mims, Florida exploded. They had celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary earlier that day. Harry died in the ambulance in transit from the attack, and Harriette died from her injuries 9 days later on January 3rd of 1952. Their death was the first assassination of any activist to occur during the civil rights movement, and the only time that a husband and wife were killed during the history of the movement. Now we get into the background of this case. Harry Moore and Harriette Sims married on December 25th, 1926, and moved into the Sims family home the following fall. Harry was an educator and Harriette was a former teacher turned insurance broker. In 1927, Harry was promoted to the position of principal at the local Titusville Colored School. Sorry if I get that name wrong. The city's school system was racially segregated like many others in the country at the time. Harry taught the school's 9th grade. The school taught grades 1 to 9, and he also supervised the team of teachers at the school. The school was closed early his first year by the local school board just 6 months into the year as part of the local school system's systemic discrimination against black children. The Moores had their first daughter in 1928 and moved into their own home with an acre of land given to them by Harriette's parents. They gave birth to their second daughter in 1930. Harriette returned to her career in education the following year and later began working as a teacher for the same school as Harry. In 1934, Harry founded the Brevard County, Florida National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP chapter. He later served as the NAACP's first executive secretary in the state of Florida. The NAACP chapter worked towards achieving equal pay for equal work for teachers of any race, fought to get lynchings prosecuted, and attempted to register black voters in the region. Moore's activism was highly controversial in the local white-dominated county. In 1946, it resulted in the firings of Harry and Harriette from their teaching jobs by state authorities. Harry then became a full-time employee of the NAACP. Now we come to the infamous, controversial, and disgusting Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws introduced in the southern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that enforced racial segregation, Jim Crow being a pejorative term for an African American. Such laws remained in force until 1965. Formal and informal segregation policies were present in other areas of the United States as well, even if several states outside the South had banned discrimination in public accommodations and voting. Southern laws were enacted by white-dominated state legislature to disenfranchise and remove political and economic gains made by African Americans during the Reconstruction era. Such continuing racial segregation was also supported by the successful Lily White movement of Southern Republicans. In practice, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities in the state of the former Confederate States of America and in some others beginning in the 1870s. Jim Crow laws were upheld in 1896 in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine concerning facilities for African Americans. Moreover, public education had essentially been segregated since its establishment in most of the South after the Civil War in 1861 to 1865. 1965. Companion laws excluded almost all African Americans from the vote in the South and deprived them of any representation government. Although in theory the equal segregation doctrine governed public facilities and transportation too, facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to facilities for white Americans. Sometimes there were no facilities for the black community at all. Far from equality as a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational, political, and social disadvantages and second-class citizenship for most African Americans living in the United States. After the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was founded in 1909, it became involved in a sustained public protest and campaigns against the Jim Crow laws and the so-called separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, segregation of public schools, state-sponsored, was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in the landmark case Brown v. Topeka Board of Education. In some states, it took many years to implement this decision, while the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow legislation in other cases, such as Heart of Atlanta Motel Incorporated v. United States, 1964. In general, the remaining Jim Crow laws were overturned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now we get to who Harry T. Moore was. Harry Tyson Moore, born November 16th of 1905 and tragically died December 25th of 1951, was an African-American educator, a pioneer leader of the Civil Rights Movement, founder of the first branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in Brevard County, Florida, and president of the state chapter of the NAACP. Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriette Moore, also an educator, were the victims of a bombing at their home in Mims, Florida, which I'll get into later in this podcast, on Christmas night of 1951. As the local hospital in Titusville would not treat blacks, he died on the way to the nearest one that would, a black hospital in Sanford, Florida, about 30 miles to the northwest. His wife died from her wounds 9 days later, on January 3rd of 1952, at the same hospital. This followed their both having been fired from teaching because of their activism. The murder case was investigated, including by the FBI in 1951 to 52, but no one was ever prosecuted. 2 more investigations were conducted in the 1970s and 1990s. A state investigation and forensic work in 2005 to 2006 resulted in naming the likely perpetrators as 4 Ku Klux Klan members, all long dead by that time. Harry T. Moore was the first NAACP member and official to be assassinated for civil rights activism. The couple are the only husband and wife to be killed for the movement. Moore has been called the first martyr of this stage of the civil rights movement that expanded in the 1960s. In the early 1930s, Moore had become state secretary for the Florida chapter of the NAACP. Through his registration activities, he greatly increased the number of members, and he worked on issues of housing and education. He investigated lynchings, filed lawsuits against voter registration barriers and white primaries, and worked for equal pay for black teachers in public schools. Moore also led the Progressive Voters League. Following a 1944 U.S. Supreme Court ruling against white primaries between 1944 and 1950, he succeeded in increasing the registration of black voters in Florida to 31% of those eligible to vote, markedly higher than in any other southern state. Now we come to his early life and family. Harry Tyson Moore was born on November 18th of 1905 in Houston, Florida. Both the Moores completed college degrees at Bethune-Cookman College, a historically black college in Daytona Beach. Both their daughters also earned college degrees at Bethune-Cookman College. Now we come to his civil rights activism. In 1934, soon after the birth of their daughters, the Moores founded the Brevard County chapter of the NAACP. Moore also helped organize the statewide NAACP organization. Through his registration activities, he greatly increased the number of members, and he worked on issues of housing and education. He investigated lynchings, filed lawsuits against voter registration barriers and white primaries, and worked for equal pay for black teachers in public schools, although they were segregated. In 1946, both the Moores were fired from their teaching jobs because of their activism. Harry Moore was working to gain equal pay for black public school teachers in the Brevard County segregated school system. Such economic retaliation was widely used in southern states to discourage activism. Harry Moore accepted a paid position with the NAACP in order to survive economically. Moore also led the Progressive Voters League following a 1944 US Supreme Court ruling against white primaries as unconstitutional, which the Democratic Party had used as another means of excluding blacks from politics between 1944 and 1950. Moore succeeded in increasing the registration of black voters in Florida to 31% of those eligible to vote, markedly higher than in any other southern state. Now we get into what the NAACP was. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, NAACP, which I've talked about all through this podcast thus far, is a civil rights organisation in the United States formed in 1909 as an interracial endeavour to advance justice for African Americans by a group including W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story, and Ida B. Wells. Sorry if I get any of those names wrong. Over the years, leaders of the organisation have included Thurgood Marshall and Roy Wilkins. Its mission in the 21st century is, quote, to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination, end quote. National NAACP initiatives included political lobbying, publicity efforts, and litigation strategies developed by its legal team. The group enlarged its mission in the late 20th century by considering issues such as police misconduct, the status of black foreign refugees, and questions of economic development. Its name, retained in accordance with tradition, uses once common term coloured people, referring to those with some African ancestry. The NAACP bestows annual awards on African Americans in 3 categories. Image awards are for achievements in the arts and media, theatre awards are for achievements in theatre and stage, and Spingarn medals are for outstanding achievements of any kind. Its headquarters is in Baltimore, Maryland. On June 29th of 2020, WTOP-FM, a Washington, D.C. news radio station, reported that the NAACP intended to relocate its national headquarters from its longtime home in Baltimore to the Franklin D. Reeves Center of Municipal Affairs, a building owned by the government of the District of Columbia, located at U and 14th Streets in Northwest Washington, D.C. Derek Johnson, the NAACP's president and CEO, emphasized that the organization will be better able to engage in and influence change in D.C. than in Baltimore. Now we come to the controversial Groveland case, or also known as the Groveland Four. The Groveland Four, or the Groveland Boys, were 4 African-American men, Ernest Thomas, Charles Green Lee, Samuel Shepard, and Walter Irvine. In July of 1949, the 4 were accused of raping a white woman and severely beating her husband in Lake County, Florida. The oldest, Thomas, tried to elude capture and was killed that month. The others were put on trial. Shepard and Irvine received death sentences, and Green Lee was sentenced to life in prison. The events of the case led to serious questions about the arrests, allegedly coerced confessions, and mistreatment, and the unusual sentencing following their convictions. Their incarceration was exacerbated by their systemic and unlawful treatment, including the death of Shepard and the near-fatal shooting of Irvine. Green Lee was paroled in 1962 and Irvine in 1968. All 4 were promiscuously exonerated by the state of Florida in 2021. Now we get into the details of the case. Thomas, Shepard, Irvine, and Green Lee, then 16, were accused of raping 17-year-old Norma Paget and assaulting her husband on July 16th of 1949 in Groveland, Lake County, Florida. On July 26th of 1949, Thomas fled and was killed by a sheriff's posse of 1,000 white men who shot him over 400 times while he allegedly fled after being found asleep under a tree in southern Madison County. Green Lee, Shepard, and Irvine were arrested. They were beaten to coerce confessions, but Irvine refused to confess. The 3 survivors were convicted at a trial by an all-white jury. Green Lee was sentenced to life in prison because he was only 16 at the time of the alleged crime. The other 2 were sentenced to death. In 1949, Harriette V, the executive director of the Florida NAACP, organized a campaign against the wrongful conviction of the 3 African Americans. 2 years later, the case of 2 defendants reached the Supreme Court of the United States on appeal, with special counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund Thurgood Marshall as their defense counsel. In 1951, the US Supreme Court ordered a retrial after hearing the appeals of Shepard and Irvine. It ruled that they had not received a fair trial because no evidence had been presented, because of excessive adverse publicity, as well as because black people had been excluded from the jury. The court overturned the convictions and remanded the case to the lower court for a new trial. In November of 1951, Sheriff Willis V. McCall of Lake County, Florida, shot Irvine and Shepard while they were in his custody and handcuffed them together. McCall claimed they'd tried to escape while he was transporting them from Rayford State Prison back to the county seat of Tavares for the new trial. Shepard died on the spot, Irvine survived, and later told FBI investigators that McCall had shot him in cold blood and that his deputy Yates had also shot him in an attempt to kill him. Harry Moore called for the governor of Florida to suspend McCall. On Christmas night of 1951, a bomb went off below Moore's house, fatally wounding both him and his wife. He died that night and his wife followed 9 days later. The bombers were never caught. At the second trial, Irvine was represented by Marshall and again convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. In 1955, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison by recently elected Governor Leroy Collins. He was paroled in 1968 but died the next year in Lake County, purportedly of natural causes. Greenlee was paroled in 1962 and lived with his family until he died in 2012. In 2016, the county of Groveland and Lake County each apologized to survivors of the four men for the injustice against them. On April 18th of 2017, a resolution of the Florida House of Representatives requested that all four men be exonerated. The Florida Senate quickly passed a similar resolution and lawmakers called on Governor Rick Scott to officially pardon the men. On January 11th of 2019, the Florida Board of Executive Clemency voted to pardon the Groveland Four. Newly elected Governor Ron DeSantis subsequently did so. On November 22nd of 2021, Judge Heidi Davis granted the state's motion to promiscuously exonerate the men. Now, that is just a short cliff notes of that actual case. I am going to do a full cover of the Groveland 4 case in another episode of this podcast, but I just thought that I would add in the basics of the case as it relates to Harry and Harriette Moore's death. Now we come to Harriette Moore. Harriette Vida Sims Moore, born June 19th of 1902 and tragically died on January 3rd of 1952, was an American educator and civil rights worker. She was the wife of Harry T. Moore, who founded the first branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in Brevard County, Florida. The murder of the Moores was the first assassination to happen during the civil rights movement and the only time both a husband and wife were killed for their activism. Now we get into her early life. Harriette Vida Sims was born in West Palm Beach, Florida on June 19th of 1902 to David Ira Sims, a wood lathe worker, and Annie Warren Sims. Her sisters were Valerie and May, and her brothers were George, Arnold, Rupert, and David Jr. The family relocated to Mims, Florida, and as a youth, Harriette spent summers working in Massillon, Ohio with her father. She attended the segregated Daytona National Industrial Institute in Daytona Beach, Florida. She later graduated from Bethune-Cookman College, a historically black college in Daytona Beach, with an Associate of Arts degree in 1941 and a Bachelor of Science degree in 1950. Sims taught elementary school classes for many years in Merritt Island and Mims in Brevard County and in Lake Park, Florida until her death. In Mims, she helped cook the lunch every day for the pupils. Sims met Harry Tyson Moore while she was teaching classes in Brevard County. He was then working as principal in the Titusville Colored School. Sorry if I get that name wrong. They married on December 25th of 1926 and had two daughters together, Annie Rose Lee, known as Peaches, who was born in 1928 and died in 1972, and Juanita Evergreen, sorry if I get that name wrong, known as Evergreen, who was born in 1930 and died in 2015. Now we come to her civil rights activism. Soon after the births of their daughters, the Moores founded the Brevard County chapter of the NAACP in 1934. Harry Moore later helped to organize a statewide NAACP organization. In 1946, both Moores were fired by the Brevard County public school system and blacklisted for their political activities. Now we get into the murder of these two black activists. On the night of December 25th, 1951, the Moores finished celebrating Christmas and their 25th wedding anniversary. When they later retired to their bedroom for the evening, a bomb exploded, injuring Harry and Harriette, but leaving their daughter, who was home at the time, the other being in a different location, unharmed. The improvised explosive device, IED, which was made from dynamite, had been placed directly under the Moores' bedroom floor. The Moores were rushed to the nearest hospital that would treat African Americans in Sanford, Florida, a 29.8 miles, 48 kilometer drive by car. Harry died while being transported. His wife, Harriette, lived to see her husband buried before she died 9 days later from her own injuries. Now we get into the investigation and motive of this crime. Over the years, a number of motives have been suggested for the Moores' deaths. All of them share a common theme: retribution against Harry Moore for his civil rights activities. End quote. Now, that was a quote by Charlie Crist, the 35th Attorney General of the state of Florida. Since the night of the explosion in 1951, 5 separate criminal investigations have been initiated and completed. The first investigation was headed by the FBI, which began on the night of the explosion and concluded in 1955. The second investigation was a joint investigation by the Brevard County Sheriff's Office and Brevard County State Attorney's Office in 1978. The third investigation took place in 1991 by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE. In 1999, journalist Ben Green published a book based on his research of the case, Before His Time: The Untold Story of Harry T. Moore, America's First Civil Rights Martyr. His research had gone deeply into the FBI files, and Green's book was followed by a public broadcasting service PBS show about Moore's life, which was called Freedom Never Dies: The Legacy of Harry T. Moore, which was done in 2000. In 2004, a fourth investigation was commenced by the Florida Attorney General's Office of Civil Rights. In 2005, Florida Attorney General Charlie Crist reopened a state investigation of Harry and Harriette Moore's deaths. The Moores' only surviving daughter, Juanita Evergreen Moore, encouraged Crist in the efforts to uncover the identity of her parents' killers. Forensic teams combed the former site of the Moores' house for evidence. The site is now within a national park. On August 16th of 2006, Crist announced the results of the work of the State Office of Civil Rights and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Rumors linking Sheriff Willis V. McCall to the crime were proven false. Based on extensive evidence, the state concluded that the Moores were victims of a conspiracy by members of a Central Florida clavern of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. In 2008, the FBI again investigated the Moores' homicides as part of the Department of Justice's Cold Case Initiative. The state twice returned to the Moore murders, but were unable to file charges since most of the men whom it suspected in the crime had died. In total, the 5 criminal investigations revealed evidence implicating 4 subjects in the bombing. The 4 subjects were known to be high-ranking members within the Ku Klux Klan in the central region of Florida. The first of the 4, Earl J. Brooklyn, was a Klansman with a reputation for being exceedingly violent and described as a renegade after being expelled from a clavern of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia for engaging in unsanctioned acts of violence. Brooklyn reportedly was in possession of floor plans of the Moore home and was said to be recruiting volunteers to assist in the bombing. The second subject, Tillman H. Curley Belvin, was also reported to be a violent member of the Klan and a close friend of Brooklyn. Joseph Cox, another Klansman, was implicated in the bombing by a fellow Klansman, Edward L. Spivey. Spivey implicated Cox in a deathbed confession while he suffered in the late stages of cancer in 1978. Cox committed suicide in 1952, one day after he was confronted by the FBI. Both Brooklyn and Belvin died while the FBI's initial investigation was being conducted. Belvin died of natural causes in August of 1952, and Brooklyn died of natural causes on Christmas Day 1952, 1 year to the day after the bombing. The investigation revealed that Harry's civil rights and advocacy made him a known target of the Klan. No arrests were ever made in the case, and all 4 of the subjects are now deceased. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division closed the file on the federal investigation in 2011. Now we get to the public reaction of this case. During the early morning hours of the following day, December 26th of 1951, angry men in Titusville black neighborhoods were in the streets spreading word of the bombing. In the following hours, men and women from Brevard County, still in their nightclothes, walked and rode towards Mims to protest in the streets. Most of the people knew Moore personally, some via his job and education, others via the NAACP, and still others through his registration drives. The assassination triggered nationwide protests, with rallies, memorials, and other events held following the news of the bombing. President Harry S. Truman and Governor Fuller Warren both received a high volume of telegrams and letters in protest of the murder of the civil rights activists in Mims, Florida. In New York City, a few weeks later, on January 5th of 1952, Jackie Robinson held a memorial service drawing approximately 3,000 mourners. The NAACP held a memorial service in March of 1952 in the Madison Square Garden that was attended by 15,000 people, and speakers like Langston Hughes had come to give their respects. Now here is a piece that Langdon Hughes actually spoke. Quote, "And this he says, our Harry Moore, as from the grave he cries, no bomb can kill the dreams I hold, for freedom never dies." End quote. Langston Hughes, 1951. Now we come to the awards and tributes in this case. In 1952, the year following the Moores' deaths, Harry was posthumously awarded the NAACP's Spingarn Medal. In 1999, the site of the Moores' home in Mims, Florida, where the bombing occurred, became a historical heritage landmark of the state of Florida. 5 years later, Brevard County's local government christened the Harry T. and Harriette Moore Memorial Park an interpretive center. To this day, the bombing, even though it's technically been solved, still remains unsolved. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions Podcast. Until next time, next on Unanswered Questions. The Groveland Four, or the Groveland Boys, were four African-American men: Ernest Thomas, Charles Greenlee, Samuel Shepard, and Walter Irvine. In July of 1949, the four were accused of raping a white woman and severely beating her husband in Lake County, Florida.